This is Alternative Political Analysis, and this video will be on the approval ratings of American presidents. And let's start with the current president, Donald Trump, whose highest approval rating was 46%, which came on the 24th of January this year. And the lowest approval rating he had was 37%, which is 1% lower than Obama's lowest approval rating. And that came on St. Patrick's Day this year. And the range between the highest approval rating and the lowest approval rating is 9%. And the highest disapproval rating was 58%, which also came on St. Patrick's Day this year. And the highest margin, that means the most preferable approval to disapproval rating was 1% in Donald Trump's favour, and that was on the 24th of January this year, along with his highest approval rating. And the lowest margin, which means the highest disapproval to approval rating, was 21% higher disapproval, which came on St. Patrick's Day this year. And his approval average is 42% so far, and his presidency is only starting, and he could have yet more higher approval ratings and yet more lower approval ratings. We'll just have to wait and see. Obama, his highest approval rating was 69%, and strangely enough it came 8 years prior to Trump's highest approval rating, which was 24th of January 2017, whereas Obama's was 24th of January 2009. And it's starting to become a spooky correlation, because, as I said, his lowest approval was 38, just 1% above Trump's, and that came 3 years ago on the 5th of September 2014. And the range between his highest approval rating and his lowest approval rating was 31%. His highest disapproval was 57%, just one below Donald Trump, and that came on the 10th of October 2014. And the highest margin was 56% in his favour, and that came at the same time as his highest approval rating, which was the 24th of January 2009, as I have already told you. And his lowest margin came with his highest disapproval on the 10th of October 2014, and that meant his disapproval was above his approval by 18%, and he departed with an approval rating of 59%, but he averaged 47.9%, so 48% more or less. And George W. Bush, highest approval rating 90%. Incredible, isn't it? And people who are being hyperbolic about Trump, please, you don't remember Bush. And that was the 21st of September 2001. That's within a fortnight of 9/11. Context: his lowest approval rating, which he achieved on no less than three occasions, 25%, the 5th of October 2008, the 12th of October 2008, the 2nd of November 2008, and that means he had a range of 65% between his highest approval rating and his lowest approval rating. And unsurprisingly, George W. Bush had the highest disapproval rating of any president since FDR. That's the 10th of October 2008, 71%. That's almost 3/4 of Americans against George W. Bush. And quite frankly, justifiably so. The highest margin for Bush, as I said, was within a fortnight after 9/11, and the disapproval margin was 83% in his favour. And on the 12th of October 2008, as I said, Bush was really unpopular then. His disapproval was 46% higher than his approval rating, and he departed with the lowest approval rating since Jimmy Carter. That's Jimmy Carter, the creator of Al Qaeda, and he left with a approval rating of 34%. And incredibly, George W. Bush averaged 49.4% approval rating. That means he had almost half the country with him on his far right socialist neocon program. Wow, that's mind boggling. And we come on to Bill Clinton. Oh God. His highest approval rating was 73% on the 19th of December 1998. Merry Christmas, everyone. That was after he had screwed over Ireland and bombed Iraq and Yugoslavia, but never mind that. His lowest approval rating was in his first year, 37%, which is the same as Donald Trump's lowest approval rating so far, and that was on the 6th of June 1993. That means that the range between his highest approval rating and his lowest approval rating was 36%. His highest disapproval rating was on the 7th of September 1994, and that was 54%. I think we can thank NAFTA for that one. The highest margin between his approval and disapproval was on the 17th of December 2000, 45% in his favour. Lowest margin was on the 7th of September when he had his highest disapproval due to NAFTA, and that was his disapproval was 14% higher than his approval. and he departed with 66% of the country approving of him, two-thirds. That's frightening, as is the average approval rating of 55.1%. That's over half of America approving of his bovine excrement. Oh goodness. Yeah, Bush the son was bad, but it ran in the family. And his highest approval rating, only outdone by his son and Truman on this chart, 89% on the 28th of February 1991. Yeah, that's because of genocidal slaughter in Iraq. That's what the American public approved of. Wow. His lowest approval was on the 2nd of August 1992 and the 13th of October 1992, 29%. I think that was due to breaking his promise of no new taxes. That means a range of 60% between his highest and lowest approval. His highest disapproval was on the 31st of July 1992, and that was 60%. And we got to consider this: he was negotiating NAFTA, which Clinton implemented, so that might have played into things. And the highest margin was on the 3rd of March 1991, which was between his approval and disapproval, which was 82%, and his lowest margin, which was on the 2nd of August 92 and 13th of October, which was his disapproval was 30% higher than his approval. He departed with 56% approval, and he had an incredibly high 60.9% of the American public with him. So that's 61%. That's almost two-thirds of the American public approving of what that warmongering idiot done. This is depressing when you really think about this. Oh, and another good one. Reagan. Oh boy. 71% of Americans approved of him at his most popular, which was the 30th of January 1986. His lowest approval rating was the 31st of January 1983, which was 35%. That gives him a range of 36%. His highest disapproval was 20th of January 1983, 56%, which means the highest margin in his favour was the 30th of January 1986, 52%. Approval higher than disapproval. But on the 31st of January 1983, his disapproval was 21% higher than his approval. And he departed with 63% of the country. That's almost two-thirds of the country approving of what he done, which damaged the American economy for decades to come and American society. And he had an average approval rating of 52.8%. That means over half the country were with him. That's incredible. That's mind-boggling. And as I've already mentioned, the creator of Al Qaeda, check out Operation Cyclone if you don't believe me, Jimmy Carter. And he had a high approval rating of 74% on the 15th of March 1977, and the lowest approval rating he had was 28% on the 26th of June 1979 and the 2nd of October 1979, and that gives him a range of 46% between his highest approval rating and his lowest approval rating. His highest disapproval rating, and think about this is a guy that created Al Qaeda, 20 or 59%, and that was on the 26th of June 1979. And the highest margin between his approval and disapproval was 66% in his favour. And the highest margin between his disapproval and approval was 31% higher disapproval, and that was on the 26th of June 1979. He departed with 34% the country approving of what he'd done, like George W. Bush, and he had an average of 45.5%. That's 46%. Think about that. Donald Trump's highest approval rating is what Carter had on average, and he had no right to interfere in the Democratic Republic of Afghanistan. I'll tell you one thing, under Wahhabism, it is not a democratic republic. So, well done, Jimmy Carter. Well done. And we move on to Gerald Ford, the guy who promoted Dick Cheney and Ronald Rumsfeld to the cabinet of the United States, the executive branch. Anyway, his highest approval rating was on the 13th of August 1974, and it was 70%. His lowest approval rating was 36% on the 25th of March 1975. That gives him a range of 34% between his highest and lowest approval rating. His highest disapproval rating was 46%, and that was on the 15th of April 1975 and the 18th of November 1975, which was 46%, and the highest margin of approval to disapproval in Ford's favour was 26%, and that was on the 13th of August 1974, and the highest disapproval to approval rating happened 3 times, on the 25th of February 1975 to the 25th of March 1975 and the 15th of April 1975, when his disapproval was 7% higher than his approval rating, and he departed with an approval rating of 53%, and his average approval was 47.2%. And oh boy, we're on to another lovely character, Richard Nixon. And people thought that it was ridiculous of the concept that Trump could get elected. This was a country that had watched both the Bushes, Reagan, and Nixon get elected, and they were surprised. Anyway, Vietnam, betraying America, spying on the opposition. My God, Nixon was a character. And his highest approval rating was 66%, which was on the 23rd of January 1973. 2/3 of the country approved of Nixon. Wow. And I think this is the lowest approval rating of any president recorded here, bar Truman, who equals it. And on the 2nd of January 1974, 22% of America approved of him. That is a fifth of America approved of the president, and that gives him a range of 44% between his highest approval rating and his lowest. His highest disapproval rating, which shows you something, 66%, and this was in the 5th of August 1974, and it's equal to his highest approval rating. 2/3 of the country. The highest margin was 57%, and that means his approval rating was 57% higher than its disapproval rating. That was on the 17th of March 1969, and when his disapproval was highest above his approval, it was 42%. It was on the 5th of August 1974, and he departed with what I think is a historic low of 24%. That means a quarter of the country approved of the job that Richard Nixon was doing, and Richard Nixon averaged an approval of 49.1%. That is frightening. Half of America, on average, approved of the job that Richard Nixon was doing. And this brings us on to Lyndon Baines Johnson, who was also nefarious during the Vietnam War, and his highest approval rating was 79%, and that was on the 5th of March 1964, and his lowest approval rating was 34%, and that was on the 12th of August 1968. And his highest approval rating can be explained with his involvement in civil rights legislation and the Great Society rhetoric, and that gives him a range of 45% between his highest approval rating and his lowest approval rating. And Johnson's highest disapproval rating was 52%, and that was on the 12th of August 1968, and the highest margin of approval to disapproval in Johnson's favour was 75%, which means his approval was 75% higher than his disapproval on the 10th of December 1963, and when his disapproval was highest in relation to his approval was 18% in disapproval's favour, and that was the 12th of August 1968, and he departed with 49% approval, and his average approval rating was 55.1%. And this brings us on to John Fitzgerald Kennedy, and he achieved his highest rate of approval on the 5th of March 1962, and his lowest approval, which seems to be the highest on this list of presidents anyway, was 56%, and that was on the 10th of September 1963, which gives him a range of 27% between his highest approval rating and lowest approval rating. His highest disapproval rating was 30%, and that happened on the 12th of September 1963 and the 8th of November 1963, and that just means under a third disapproved of JFK, and the highest margin of approval to disapproval was on the 5th of March 1962, and The highest disapproval, the approval was 27% in approval's favour, and that happened on the 10th of September 1963, and he departed with an approval rating of 58%. That's almost two-thirds of the country approving of the job JFK did. This is despite Bay of Pigs and the other mistakes. And 70.1% is the approval rating he averaged, which is the highest on this list. This brings us on to Dwight Eisenhower, who on the 22nd of November 1955 and the 19th of December 1956 achieved approval ratings of 77%. His lowest approval rating was 47% on the 25th of March 1958, which means at his most unpopular only half the country approved of him, which gave him a range of 30% between his highest approval rating and his lowest approval rating. His highest disapproval rating was on the 25th of March 1958, when 36% of the people disapproved of him, just over a third. The highest margin of approval to disapproval happened on the 2nd of April 1953 and the 19th of December 1956, which was 66% higher approval than disapproval, and the highest disapproval to approval was 12% higher approval than disapproval, and that happened on the 25th of March 1958, and Eisenhower departed with a percentage approval of 59% when he left office, and he averaged an approval rating of 65%. And this brings us on to Harry Truman, who had a highest approval rating of 91%, and that was on the 22nd of August 1945. And his lowest approval rating was 22% on the 16th of November 1951 and the 14th of February 1952, and that was basically a fifth of the nation approving the lowest approval rating, alongside Nixon's lowest approval rating, and that gives Truman a range of 69% between his highest approval rating and lowest approval rating, and his highest disapproval rating was 67% on the 6th of January 1952, which meant two-thirds of the country disapproved of Harry Truman. The highest margin of approval to disapproval was 89% in approval's favour, and that happened on the 22nd of August 1945, and the highest disapproval, the approval margin was 43% higher disapproval, and that happened on the 4th of January 1952. He departed with an approval rating of 32%, which was a third of the country approving of him, and he averaged an approval rating of 45.4%, which means 46% of the country on average approved of him. And we'll finish off on FDR, whose highest approval rating was 83%, and that was on the 8th of January 1942. His lowest approval rating was 48%, and that was on the 18th of August 1939. That gives him a range of 36% between his highest approval and his lowest approval. His highest disapproval was 46%, and that happened 3 times on the 22nd of May 1930 and on the 29th of May 1938, and on the 7th of November 1938, and that just means under half the country disapproved of him. The highest margin of approval to disapproval was 73% in approval's favour, which was on the 23rd of January 1942. The highest disapproval, the approval rating is not known for FDR. Apologies. He departed with an approval rating of 65%, and his average approval was 63%. And I would recommend that viewers check out Alternative Political Analysis YouTube channel, blog, and Facebook page for more interesting posts and videos on this subject.